Hello, this is Lillian, and I'm going to do various things on my channel, from more stories like this, which are going to be dark or interesting, mysterious, anywhere the inspiration takes me. Also, I might do some reactions, and maybe some trying stuff. I'm not sure. I'm just going to see where the inspiration takes me, and honestly, I hope it goes well. But today my video is going to be about, well, there's three stories that are about the inspiration that some songwriters had to write certain songs, and I have three of those. And so this is Lillian, and off we go. The first story is behind the song What's the Frequency, Kenneth? And the song is from the mid-90s, but the story takes place in the mid-80s. So there was a man called Dan Rather, who was on his way home one evening when a couple of guys just came up and they started to assault him. And while they were assaulting him, one of them was asking, "What's the frequency, Kenneth?" Dan was very confused because his name was Dan, and so who was Kenneth? He thought, this is obviously a case of mistaken identity. And so he told them, that's not me, you have the wrong person. And he hoped that that would be the end of it. However, they continued to assault him. However, thankfully, he was able to escape and run into a nearby building, maybe his building, maybe a random building, but thankfully there was security there, and that caused the perpetrators to run away, and Dan was fortunately able to get medical attention. What wasn't so fortunate is that there was really no information that Dan had that could really tell the police much that would lead to an arrest. So for a lot of years, there was really nothing that could be done to make any arrests, and so these men got away with it, and Dan continued to believe that it was just a case of mistaken identity. However, 10 years later, there was a seemingly random murder of a stagehand for the Today Show, and it happened right outside the Today Show where it was filmed. And a man called Campbell Montgomery had been killed. And obviously this was tragic, but more than that, when Dan saw because fortunately the guy was arrested, when Dan saw the picture of the man when they were talking about the story, he was able to identify that man as one of the men who had assaulted him all of those years ago. And so that was another charge that was added to this man's sentence. Obviously, assault is not as bad as murder, but assault is pretty bad, let's be honest. That can turn fatal, and so that's very scary. And this man was identified as one William Tager. I'm not sure which one it is, but he had believed that the media had him under surveillance. Not only that, but he believed they were directly transmitting hostile messages directly into his noggin. And that's why when he was assaulting Dan, he was asking what's the frequency. He wanted to know, considering Dan was a news anchor, he wanted to know what the frequency was that they were using to project these harmful messages into his mind. I think it's safe to say that he had some mental difficulties, but obviously he did know who Dan was because Dan worked in the media, and he wanted to know about what frequency the media was using. And so we're not quite sure to this day why he was calling him Kenneth. However, it seemed he did know who Dan was. And so in the mid-90s, the song was released about the incident that had happened the 10 years before. And thankfully, William Tagger was sentenced to 25 years in prison for the murder of Campbell Montgomery. The next story we have was actually from several decades before the assault from the previous story. In 1966, there was a very unfortunate triple, I believe, homicide that happened at a bar and grill in Lafayette, which is in Paterson, New Jersey. And obviously, when this kind of thing happens, there's going to be a lot of police presence in the area. And so there was a lot of police presence, and some men drove past in their car and they were stopped by police. Now, in that car were two men called John Artis and Reuben the Hurricane Carter. And I'm not exactly sure what caused the police to, I mean, we know why they were stopped because there was a lot of police presence in the area. I'm sure they were doing that to a lot of people. But why, oh why, you ask, were they taken in for a 17-hour-long interrogation? My theory is because these men were black, and this was 1966. I don't really think they would have needed more than that, but that's what I believe was probably a big part of why they were subjected to this. But after the 17-hour interrogation, they were released. However, several weeks later, John Artis and Reuben were rearrested. Now, in 1976, there was a retrial. Unfortunately, the sentence that they were originally given was upheld, and so they were sent back to prison. They got life sentences for all three homicides, and so their sentences were upheld and they were made to continue to stay in prison. And again, almost 20 years after the murders, there was another retrial, and finally, they were released, which, better late than never. However, 20 years of these men's life had been wasted for something that they obviously did not do. When they were still in prison, however, Reuben wrote and released an autobiography, and Bob Dylan released the song The Hurricane a year later in the mid-70s about the injustice. They had not been found, they had not been, released from prison yet. obviously, but obviously Bob Dylan knew that this was an injustice, and so he wrote and released a song about it. And after he was released, Reuben did stay out of prison until his death in 2014. The last story I have for you today, this one, I mean, all of these stories were very sad because there was death involved and injustice, but this one just makes me especially sad just because, I mean, you'll see, it's all of them were sad, but this one just really touches me. It takes place in 1997, and there was an elderly couple called Leela and Raymond Howard. Now, they were in their 80s, and every year since they got married, or at least for many years, they would go to a nearby town because there was a day festival that would happen there at certain points of the year. And so, just like every year, Leela and Raymond wanted to go to this day festival again. But I'm sure we've all seen cases like this. Once people get into the late stages of their life, there is often a mental decrease, and they had really been showing signs of this. Leela more so than Raymond, but they had been, I mean, their family had noticed that their age was really showing in the way that they acted and their cognitive ability. So their son, who had noticed this, was very concerned about them, and so he was like, how about I take you and bring you home? But they were adamant. We've been to this area so many times, we'll be fine. We do this every year, you know, we know this like the back of our hand, we will be fine. And so that's what they did. Leela was driving, Raymond in the passenger seat, and off they went. However, by the afternoon, they had still not returned, and so their family became increasingly worried about them, and they contacted the authorities to get help and eventually file a missing persons report. Now, it wasn't until 3 days later there was a deputy. He was in. It wasn't until 3 days later a deputy in rural Arkansas. Now, this was 500 miles away from their starting point in Texas, where they left. 500 miles away, and 3 days later, a deputy saw that there was a car, and whoever was driving with their lights off. So he pulled them over and he informed them they're driving with their lights off. I'm sure they noticed, but obviously he pulled them over for that. And so he pulled them over, and he said that the elderly couple inside, they were very nice. There was no cause for concern. They seemed fine. The only thing that was a little bit shocking was that they asked him to tell them how to get back to Texas. Now, they were driving in the complete wrong direction, so he was surprised, but he pointed them in the direction that they needed to head, and off they went. Half an hour later, a different deputy nearby, he saw somebody driving with their high beams on. So the lights were on, the high beams were on, and so he pulled over this car, and he informed them that you're driving with your high beams on. I don't know how to drive, so I'm not sure what the problem is. I don't know what high beams are, but I assume it's when the lights are too bright and that can be dangerous for other drivers because it can blind them. But I could be wrong, I don't know how to drive. So he pulled them over and he told them, your high beams are on. And again, the couple inside was fine. There was no cause for concern. And so after he told them, they fixed the issue and again, off they went. However, by the next day, there were police in several, I think 11 states, were looking for this couple because they had been missing for days now. And obviously, with the mental decline, it was very concerning. And so there were police in 11 states looking for them. There was a story in the newspaper. Now, the story in the newspaper will be important later on in the story, but there was a story in the newspaper, and a journalist came to their house where Leela and Raymond lived. And they said that the mental decline was obvious. Well, there were signs. There were signs in the home because by this point it was July. It was July and the calendar still was on February. So you could say maybe they just didn't use a calendar very often, but it's a little strange that for months they hadn't changed the calendar at all. And so there were signs that something may be wrong, but the biggest thing was that there was a story written for the newspaper, and so their disappearance, a lot of people knew about this disappearance. Now, sadly, several weeks after they had gone missing, their car and remains were discovered at the bottom of a ravine. They had gone 25 feet down, and Raymond was still in his seat, in the passenger seat, and Leela, her door was open and she was 20 feet away. She wasn't far. She had her handbag in her hand and the car keys, and it seemed like perhaps Raymond had died on impact. And Leela, shaken, injured, probably, had tried to go get help, or I'm not sure, but she was found very nearby. Both of them were deceased, and obviously there was an investigation, and they believe that they just didn't see the road end to go off this cliff. I mean, we know that they were having problems with their lights because of them being pulled over, and so it's not hard to believe that maybe they turned the lights off again, especially after they had been pulled over for having their high beams on. Maybe they turned the lights off and Leela maybe hadn't seen the end of the road because there was no signs that she had broke or tried to swerve. Just at, I'm not sure, at 50 miles an hour, they estimate, it seemed like she had just gone straight off this cliff and they went down into the ravine. So the best guess is that they had turned the lights off again, and so they didn't see the end of the road. Now, in the middle of the search for them, as I said, there was a article written about their disappearance in the newspaper. There was a songwriter called Tony Scalzo, and he saw this story in the newspaper, And so he found inspiration in this. Where people find inspiration can be anywhere and anything. He read this story and he found inspiration in this story. And so he wrote a song for an alternative rock band called Fastball. And the name of the song was The Way. Hey guys, thank you for watching. If anybody is here watching this, I don't know if anybody's going to watch it, but I'm probably going to keep making videos. I'm pretty confident that I will. I would like to make plenty of videos. I'm not sure exactly where the inspiration for this channel is going to take me as of right now, but I think I mentioned before, I'm hoping to do more stories like this, as well as reactions and trying things and just see where inspiration takes me. And so I hope you can give this a like. I mean, it's my first video, you don't have to, but I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like. If you're interested at all in where I go with the channel, you can subscribe. But again, if anybody's here, thank you for watching. And again, this is Dower Lillian. My name is Abigail, and goodbye.